Absolutely, Nancy. I mean, it's very, very clear here that the Saudis have lost control of the narrative, that all of those millions of dollars in PR that they've been spending over the last couple of years to really bring the message to the world that they are changing, that they are a forward-looking society today has really been squandered over the last couple of weeks. But at the same point, I think that the moral outrage that you continue to hear from inside the Beltway and that echo chamber of Washington is pretty blatantly political, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, I mean, when we talk about the Middle East, when we talk about covering the Middle East, whether we're talking about Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia, at the end of the day, I mean, it's kind of like domesticating a tiger. You can't really be surprised at the end of the day when it turns out to still be an animal. So I think that that's a little bit overblown. But I think in terms of the business narrative, going forward, you know, the thing that this was surprising to me about being on the ground there in Saudi Arabia was the level of astonishment internally that they were getting this kind of pushback and that the business community seemed to be at least abandoning them in the headlines. But as we've seen over the last couple of days, you know, it isn't like these guys aren't going to be sending representatives to this conference. I mean, people are still going to show up here, and, you know, the vibe that I'm getting, certainly from the organizers and certainly from the companies in Saudi Arabia who we were going to talk to a couple of weeks ago before all of these things came out in the press, was that they're still going full steam ahead. Now, that could change off the back of the fact that Mnuchin isn't going, but at the moment, people are still knocking on our door and wanting to be on TV. So that kind of speaks to not only the fact that they're going to go full steam ahead on this, but also this level of disconnect that there seems to be about, you know, having missed the narrative here.
Yes, Hadley, and I think the really interesting thing with Secretary Mnuchin was just last week he was speaking to Jeff Cutmore saying, well, I am going. And so this really shows that the turn of events, just in a matter of days, weren't quite enough to convince him that he could still go to this event. And I think I just want to bring Rob into this conversation here because, Rob, one thing I've been talking a lot about with Hadley is what are the longer term implications? Because we know, of course, Saudi's embarking on a big 2030 vision.
Well, I think that must be on their minds now because, you know, part of this 2030 vision is really for Saudi over time to wean itself away from just relying on oil and to have a much more diversified economy. And I think for that and to develop other sectors, it really needs foreign, Western investment, but particularly skills and technology. And without that, longer term, I think it's going to be tough.
Let's just go back to Hadley on this one, too, because, Hadley, you pointed out from the top that this is really a political story. We wonder to what extent the business community is looking to the politicians for the reaction here, for some kind of conclusion, if you will. You would have seen the opinion piece in the New York Times stating quite strongly why King Salman must replace MBS. We've heard some similar mumblings in other articles in major newspapers as well. I mean, talking about an actual reshuffling here. You've spent so much time in Saudi Arabia. You know how these power politics work. I mean, is that something people are talking about on the ground there? How likely do you think that is?
I mean, talking about that from an op-ed in the New York Times, I mean, who are they suggesting that they actually replace Mohammed bin Salman with? That's the first question. I mean, we're talking about his younger brother who's been ambassador for only several months in Washington. Are we saying that he's going to have the experience to go in there and really be able to affect change the way that Mohammed bin Salman has done? I mean, at the end of the day, what we were talking about over the last 18 months or so was the fact that he's been able to do what he's been able to do so quickly in terms of the cultural reforms, in terms of really pushing back on the religious establishment in that country and saying, hey, listen, we're moving into the 21st century and you need to come along. And I think that it's interesting that we're hearing this echo chamber again and again about coming out of Washington about potentially removing MBS. I mean, I think that people need to take a step back and say, what would we be replacing him with? But at the same time, I do think it's really important to highlight the fact that what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia since the Crown Prince really started to take power there into his own hands in terms of moving the economy forward, in terms of moving the cultural reforms forward as well, is that, you know, this isn't your parents' Saudi Arabia. And when we look at the older generation, there's no doubt that they're absolutely horrified by what's been taking place potentially in that country.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.